Economic Opportunity, the Office of Economic Opportunity. The president announced his entire cabinet at one time in a nationally televised event, and we have a film clip from that is going to come up.
This is a special report from NBC News. President-elect Richard M. Nixon names his cabinet. Here is NBC News correspondent Edwin Newman.
Good evening. At this moment, the 12 men who will head the major executive departments of the United States government for the next 4 years are in the Palladian room of the Shoreham Hotel in Washington. President-elect Richard Nixon is scheduled to appear shortly to identify those 12 men, in short, to name his cabinet. Within the next half hour, we will see the shape of the forthcoming Nixon administration.
And now at the outset, I wish to express appreciation to the radio and television networks for providing this opportunity for the first time in history for millions of Americans to be present, in effect, as a president-elect names the members of his cabinet. In introducing the members of the cabinet to you tonight, I'm not going to go through the usual procedure of giving the biographical material, where they were born, where they went to school, how many children they have, and the like. You can read that in your morning papers or in Who's Who. What I am going to do, however, is to share with you this evening some of the concerns that went through my mind as I made this tremendously important decision with regard to the cabinet. Because as I had to decide the men who are to lead this nation in the next 4 years, considerations beyond what their academic records happen to be, or their records in business, professional life, or in government, all of those considerations were important. But in selecting men for the highest positions in government, there has to be an extra dimension which is the difference between good leadership and superior or even great leadership.
President Nixon then goes on at that event to walk you through each cabinet officer and why he chose them. And I happened to watch it. I was in law school, and I happened to watch it live. And one of the intriguing things to me is he skips Maurice Stans, one of his very best friends, and he just thinks he's covered him. And Stans, you can see it in his face. He's trying to decide whether to raise his hand and say, "You skipped me," and he chooses not to, and the president goes on. But what's so intriguing about President Nixon, and one of his greatest strengths, in that video clip, there's no teleprompter. He's not looking down at notes like I am. President Nixon is winging it. And it was one of the incredible strengths of that individual. He could stand up and he could give a 45-minute speech without notes. And in that era, when you didn't have teleprompting, when you couldn't do that, under the glare of cameras, where you really shouldn't make a mistake, it was an incredible performance. Those selections of that original cabinet, along with others who came afterwards, read like a leadership directory for subsequent administrations. We kind of put together a list of other names that you should recognize. John Connally, Bill Simon, and Paul Volcker at Treasury, William Rehnquist and Antonio Scalia at Justice, Earl Butz at Agriculture, Peter Peterson and Fred Dent at Commerce, Elliot Richardson, Leon Panetta, and Cap Weinberger at HEW, Jim Lynn at HUD, George H.W. Bush as UN Ambassador, James Baker as RNC Finance Chairman, Pat Buchanan, Elizabeth Hanford Dole, Barbara Franklin, David Gergen, Alan Greenspan, Virginia Nauer, Tom Korologos, and his now wife Anne McLaughlin Korologos, all from the White House staff. John Bolton on the Vice President's staff, Al Haig, John Lehman, and Brent Scowcroft on the NSC, Lou Engman and Henry Paulson. Hank was a kid just like I was on the Domestic Council. Roy Ash, Fred Malek, Paul O'Neill, Don Rice, Jim Schlesinger at OMB, Frank Carlucci and Dick Cheney at OEO, Helen Bentley at the Federal Maritime Commission, Ken Duberstein at GSA, and Bill Ruckelshaus at EPA. Many people in the media found their beginnings in the Nixon administration. Roger Ailes, Brian Lamb, Bill Kristol, John McLaughlin, Diane Sawyer, and Ben Stein were all young people. That John McLaughlin wasn't that young. Were all young people there on Nixon's staff. At one point, the heads of 19 different trade associations came from the Nixon staff here in Washington. And in addition to that, there were executive officers and members of the boards of directors of hundreds of Fortune 1000 companies. All these people and numerous others originally came to Washington or came to prominence in Washington during the Nixon administration. It was an exciting time. Our panelists today helped appoint those very special teams.
The organizational structure itself had caused Watergate. And so the conventional wisdom that President Ford followed initially was he wasn't going to have a strong chief of staff. He was going to have something called the spokes of the wheel. And spokes of the wheel was nobody was in charge. You had 9 or 10 senior people all reporting to the president. We tried that for a few months and it didn't work. Nobody was in charge. We'd end up with the president double scheduled. He'd be in, having a meeting with the NSC on Soviet arms control issues, and 40 Rotarians from Grand Rapids would show up in the West Wing lobby for their meeting with the president. So we fairly quickly moved back to the chief of staff concept. And that's when I took over after Rumsfeld left, after about a year. That's certainly the way I operated. The fact of the matter is, as I look back on it and reflect now, most administrations, sooner or later, have come back and adopted what I'd describe as the Haldeman method of organizing the White House. I believe today that's the best way to operate. But it was clear when you sat there and spent a couple of days with Bob Haldeman listening to him talk about the White House and so forth, that he had spent an enormous amount of time thinking about it, that he had come up with what I think is still the best way to operate as the White House Chief of Staff with a strong central staff system, that you need that in order to protect the president, to provide the president what he needs. You might have some dispute and controversy over how it was used or how it was applied in specific circumstances. But I think that basic fundamental structure was the right one, and that sooner or later all administrations end up with something resembling that organization.
Well, that presidency rested on something called the Brandeis Brief.
Mm-hmm.
But doesn't it depend whether the president likes documents? I mean, that system,
Sure.
You need a president who absorbs by reading
Right.
and likes to have things committed to paper.
Yeah. Well, Jerry Ford did a lot on paper, but did a lot. He was a verbal guy. Liked to have meetings where we talk about issues. George Bush does too. But sooner or later, we all end up now. I think virtually every administration's had a chief of staff sooner or later. I remember when the Carter people took over after we left. Hamilton Jordan moved into the office I'd had, and there was a going away party for me as I was departing the job. The staff had a gathering where they gave me a gift. And the gift was a bicycle wheel mounted on a piece of plywood with every single spoke except one busted. There was only one spoke left connecting the rim to the hub. And they put a tag on the bottom of it, said the rare form of management artistry. The spokes of the wheel, a rare form of management artistry, is conceived by Jerry Ford and modified by Dick Cheney. And I left that in that big corner office that the Chief of Staff occupies on January 20th of 77, setting up there on the table with a note pinned to it to Hamilton Jordan, said, "Dear Hamilton, beware the spokes of the wheel."
Were you
order commands everyone in the executive branch to report on handling of classified material. But Dick Cheney has not done so since 2002. Today, the House Oversight Committee revealed that in 2004, the Information Security Oversight Office, ISOO, tried to inspect Cheney's office but was denied entry. In fact, Cheney responded by trying to destroy ISOO. Why the lack of cooperation? His office says, quote, the reporting requirement does not apply to Cheney's office, which has both legislative and executive functions. In other words, his functions outside the executive branch exempt him from oversight by the executive branch. But if he's outside the executive branch, and he's not a legislator and not a judge, there remains only one possible alternative. Vice President Dick Cheney is a rogue nation. Despite the recent capture of his top lieutenant, Mr. Cheney continues to defy the rule of law, attempting to destroy ISOO, an office of the U.S. government after all, and barring inspections in true Saddam style, leaving only one possible remedy: invade him, in order to establish a free and democratic Dick Cheney. Let's turn now to Newsweek's senior White House correspondent, and therefore apparently not Dick Cheney correspondent, Richard Wolff, also, of course, our political analyst. It is good to talk to you again tonight, sir.
Good to be with you, Keith.
If Mr. Cheney claims exemption from oversight of the executive branch, is there anything, anybody, any remaining agency whose authority he does recognize? I mean, maybe the NRA?
Yeah, well, it's not the first time they have made this argument. There are some pretty innocuous things that the Vice President's office has tried to avoid using this specious argument that was crafted, incidentally, by his Chief of Staff, David Addington, who's a pretty high-powered lawyer himself. You know, they've denied filing reports on outside travel, which the President's own aides have no problem in filing, and their argument is that they're not part of the executive branch, which is curious. I mean, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but say I was a strict constructionist, it would be pretty easy to frame the argument that the founders wanted there to be checks and balances. Obviously, it doesn't apply to the Vice President.
And if Mr. Cheney succeeded in legally carving himself out of the executive branch, would he not also necessarily abdicate many of the protections of that branch, the ones that have shielded him in this cone of silence?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, this is obviously a sort of Guantanamo Bay situation. And it has come up, for instance, in the whole debate about deleted emails. If you're going to run government business through your private accounts, then you can't then claim executive privilege. So your only possibility is, well, deleting everything. This is a very rocky path. And frankly, if it's constitutional, then I'm a banana.
Hillary Clinton permanently deleted all the emails on the private server she used to do official business as Secretary of State, the Republican lawmaker who subpoenaed the emails said late Friday. Representative Trey Gowdy of South Carolina, chairman of the House committee investigating the attacks on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, said Clinton's lawyer informed him of the news. Secretary Clinton unilaterally decided to wipe her server clean and permanently delete all emails from her personal server, Gowdy said in a statement. Gowdy had also asked that Clinton turn over her server to the State Department Inspector General for an independent review.